22 years is a long time to give a company. I know that now. I did not fully understand it on the morning my manager called me into the glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor and slid a single sheet of paper across the table like he was dealing a card. I remember the way the morning light came through the blinds and striped his face. I remember the coffee in my hand had already gone cold. I remember thinking the room smelled like dry erase markers and carpet cleaner, the same way it always had, the same way it had on my first day back in the fall of 2002. He said my name. Then he said the word restructuring. Then he said the word transition. I nodded. I did not say anything. That night I drove home and sat in my truck in the driveway for a long time. My wife had left the porch light on. I could see that small orange glow through the windshield. And I thought about my daughter starting her junior year in the fall. I thought about the number on the last statement I had received from HR. And I thought about what 22 years actually meant in a room like that one. Then I went inside, made a cup of coffee, and went looking for my original employment contract. Let me back up. I joined Meridian Industrial Group in the fall of 2002 as a senior project engineer. I was 32 years old. The company designed and manufactured specialized fluid control systems, the kind of equipment that ends up inside petrochemical plants, water treatment facilities, and power generation sites. It was not glamorous work. It was not the kind of work that gets written up in tech magazines. But it was precise, technical work, and it required people who understood both the engineering and the client side. I was good at it. Over the next 2 decades, I moved up steadily, not fast, not politically. I was never the kind of man who played golf with the right people or made a point of being seen at the right dinners. I worked. I solved problems other people did not want to touch. I built relationships with clients that outlasted 3 different CEOs at the company. By the time the acquisition talk began, I held the title of Director of Engineering Operations and managed a team of 19 people across 2 facilities. The acquisition was announced internally about 14 months before everything came apart. A larger industrial group based out of Atlanta, I will call them the parent company, was buying us. The official memo used phrases like strategic alignment and exciting growth opportunity. Most of my colleagues read it the way people always read those memos. They filed it mentally under things that probably will not affect me directly, then went back to work. I read it twice. Then I called my attorney, not because I was paranoid, because after 22 years, I had learned something simple and brutal. The people who get hurt in acquisitions are usually the people who assume good faith without verifying it. I had seen it happen before. I had watched a man named Gerald, who had been with the company longer than I had, get walked out the door 9 months after an acquisition with a handshake and a severance check that covered 3 months of salary. Gerald was 61. He never really recovered professionally. My attorney reviewed my contract. She highlighted a few sections and told me to store the document somewhere safe. Then she said something I wrote down word for word. The interesting clauses are never in the main body. Look at the schedules. My original contract had been renegotiated twice. Once when I was promoted to regional manager, and again when I moved into the director role. Each time, the HR director at the time, a woman named Patricia, had insisted on including what she called a long-term stability provision. Patricia had been straight with me from the beginning. She had seen too many good people get squeezed out before their incentive packages matured, and she had quietly built language into the contracts of certain senior staff because she believed the company owed them more than a clean smile and a fast exit. The language buried in Schedule D of my amended employment agreement said this: in the event of a material adverse change in role, title, responsibilities, or total compensation, including but not limited to demotion, involuntary reassignment, or any restructuring that resulted in a reduction of more than 15% of base compensation or the removal of previously granted incentive eligibility, such change would constitute a constructive termination at the company's election, triggering immediate full vesting and payout of all long-term incentive plan awards regardless of their scheduled vesting date. At the time the acquisition closed, my LTIP balance was $431,000. It was scheduled to vest in 3 tranches over the next 4 years. I want to be clear about what I was not doing. I was not looking for a fight. I had spent 22 years building something inside that company. I believed in the work. I had turned down 2 outside offers in the previous 5 years because I honestly thought the best version of my career was still ahead of me at Meridian. I walked into that acquisition period hoping it would be handled with integrity, and that I would spend another decade doing the work I knew how to do. What I was doing was paying attention. The first sign came 6 weeks after the acquisition closed. The parent company's integration team, a group of 4 consultants who seemed to communicate mainly through color-coded PowerPoint slides, circulated a new organizational chart. My name was still on it, but my title had changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way most people would have noticed. Director of Engineering Operations had become Senior Engineering Advisor. The reporting line had changed too. Instead of reporting to the COO, I now reported to a regional vice president I had never met, a man named Marcus, based in Atlanta, with a background in supply chain rather than engineering. I emailed him and asked for a meeting to discuss the transition. My old manager had already taken a buyout. Marcus replied 4 days later. We scheduled a call for the following Thursday. He was pleasant, professional. He used the word leverage 7 times. He talked about the parent company's vision for the combined entity. When I asked directly about my role, my team, and my compensation structure moving forward, he said everything was still being finalized and that I would have more clarity in the coming weeks. I thanked him for his time. Then I hung up, opened a new document on my computer, and started keeping a log. Over the next 3 months, the picture sharpened. My team was being restructured under a newly created operations director role, filled by someone imported from the parent company's Atlanta office. The 2 facilities I had managed were being consolidated into a different reporting structure. Client relationships I had personally maintained for more than a decade were being transferred, one by one, to a new national accounts group. Then, in month 4, I received a revised compensation letter. My base salary was unchanged, but my bonus target had been cut from 30% to 12% of base. My LTIP eligibility had been quietly removed. The letter described this as an alignment with the parent company's standard compensation framework for advisory roles. Advisory roles. I read that letter at my desk on a Tuesday afternoon. I did not react. I closed the document, locked my computer, got in my truck, and drove to my attorney's office. She read the revised compensation letter. Then she placed it beside my employment agreement. She looked up at me and said, "They just handed you Schedule D." What happened next was not impulsive. I did not fire off an angry email. I did not call Marcus and start making demands. I did not tell anyone in the office what I was thinking. I went home. I made dinner with my wife. I listened to my daughter talk about her calculus class. Then, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table and thought about what I actually wanted. The answer was simple. I wanted what I had earned, not what someone had decided to give me retroactively. What I had actually earned under the terms of a contract I had signed in good faith and performed under in good faith for 20 years, and I thought about my father. He had worked 30 years for a paper mill in northern Michigan. When the mill restructured the week before Christmas in 1998, he lost part of his pension. Not all of it, but enough. He never really complained to me. He was not that kind of man, but I watched it change something in him. A certain quiet settled over him in those years. The kind of quiet that does not leave room once it moves in. He died in 2017. I thought about that quiet at his funeral, and I thought about it again at my kitchen table. My daughter was starting college in 2 years. I had done the math. The next morning I called my attorney and told her to proceed. She sent a formal written notice to the parent company's general counsel citing the specific provisions of Schedule D, detailing the material adverse changes in role and compensation, and invoking the constructive termination clause. The letter requested full payment of my vested and unvested LTIP balance, $431,000, within 30 days pursuant to the agreement. Then I went to work. I answered emails. I sat in meetings. I stayed professional, cooperative, and steady. I did not change a single thing about how I showed up. For 11 days, I heard nothing. On the 12th day, my phone rang while I was eating lunch at my desk. It was a woman I had never spoken to before, an attorney from the parent company's legal department. Her voice was measured, almost unnervingly controlled. She asked whether I had retained outside counsel. I said I had. She asked whether we could schedule a call later that week. I told her my attorney would coordinate with her office. Then I hung up and finished my lunch. Later, my attorney told me that the call had gone in an interesting direction. The parent company's legal team began by arguing that the restructuring did not amount to a material adverse change under Schedule D. They said advisory roles were a routine part of their integration model. They said the compensation adjustments were company-wide, standardized, non-discriminatory. In other words, they tried to turn what had happened to me into policy, as if policy could erase plain language. My attorney answered with 3 points. First, the text of Schedule D made no reference to company-wide frameworks. It required only that a material change had occurred. By any fair reading, it had. Second, the removal of my LTIP eligibility alone represented a reduction in total compensation well above the 15% threshold laid out in the agreement. That by itself was enough to trigger the clause. Third, Patricia, the HR director who had drafted the original language, was still working with the company in a consulting capacity during the transition. And Patricia had kept meticulous records. I was told the call ended politely. I was also told it ended quickly. What I did not know then, what I learned only later, was what was unfolding behind the scenes while that conversation was taking place. The parent company was in the middle of finalizing a secondary financing arrangement tied to the acquisition, a significant debt facility. The lenders required a clean representation that there were no material pending employment disputes or contingent liabilities above a certain threshold. $431,000 was above that threshold. When my attorney filed the formal demand letter, she did not use bluster. She did not exaggerate. She did not threaten. She documented. Every word was accurate. Every point was grounded in the agreement. But once it was on record, it existed. And once it existed, it had to be disclosed. That changed everything. The timeline after that moved faster than I expected. On a Monday, Marcus called me directly. It was the first time he had called me himself since our original conversation 4 months earlier. He asked whether I had a few minutes. I said I did. He told me the company wanted to find a resolution. He said the integration had created some unintended complications. He said leadership had the highest regard for my contributions. He used the word valued 3 times in 4 sentences. I told him I appreciated the call. Then he asked whether there was any flexibility in my position. I told him my attorney was handling all communications related to the matter, and that any substantive discussion should go through her. I said it pleasantly, calmly, the way you speak when the decision is already made and courtesy is the only thing left to offer. He went quiet for a moment. Then he shifted. He asked whether I would consider staying on in a different capacity, a newly created role they were prepared to offer with restored compensation and future LTIP eligibility. He said the company wanted to keep my expertise inside the organization. And I will be honest with you, that moment was harder than it sounds. 22 years of investment does not switch off in a single call. Part of me heard what he was offering and felt the pull instantly. The familiar, the known, the work I had built most of my adult identity around. There was a version of that conversation where I said yes. There was a version where I agreed to figure it out and maybe even meant it in that moment. But I had watched Gerald. I had watched my father. And I had read the revised compensation letter carefully enough to understand something that mattered more than emotion. What had happened was not an accident. It was not confusion. It was not a harmless administrative reshuffle. It was a calculation. Someone had looked at the years I had given, looked at the role I had built, looked at the numbers, and calculated that I would absorb the change because most people do. Most people take the adjustment, tell themselves it is not worth the fight, and go back to work. They let the insult settle. They let time bury it. They let years of loyalty become the excuse for one last compromise. I had spent 22 years being reliable. I had earned the right to make a different calculation. The settlement was reached on a Friday, 6 weeks after my attorney sent the initial notice. The parent company agreed to pay the full LTIP balance, $431,000. The deal was structured partly as a separation payment and partly as a consulting retainer for a defined transition period, one whose terms I would control. My attorney also negotiated reimbursement of her fees. The company paid them without significant resistance. I signed the agreement that afternoon in my attorney's office. On the drive home, I stopped at a nursery and bought a flat of perennials my wife had wanted for the back garden. It was late in the season. They were on clearance. I put them in the trunk, rolled the windows down, and drove home. My wife was standing in the kitchen when I walked in. She took one look at my face and knew. She had known the shape of this for months. She is sharp, always has been. She had sat with me at that kitchen table more than once while I walked through the logic, the risk, the timing, the terms. She did not say anything at first. Then she asked, "Did you eat?" I told her I had not. She made eggs. We sat at the table, and I told her the number. She stayed quiet for a while. Then she said, "Your dad would have appreciated that." I did not answer. I just kept eating. A few weeks later, I told my daughter. We were sitting down to talk about college finances. I told her the situation had been resolved and that she did not need to worry about second-year costs the way she had quietly been worrying. She did not ask for many details. She is practical, like her mother. She just said, "So it worked out?" I said, "It did." She nodded and said, "Good, because I was looking at schools and some of them are not cheap." That was the first time I laughed in what felt like a very long time. I left the company formally at the end of the transition period. The consulting work was real. They needed continuity on 3 client accounts that would have been seriously disrupted without my involvement, and I provided it. But I provided it on my terms, on my schedule, at a rate I set. By the time that engagement ended, I had earned an additional $60,000 in consulting fees. Marcus, the regional vice president from Atlanta, left the company 8 months after the acquisition. I heard about it from a former colleague. Apparently, the integration had gone poorly on multiple fronts, and the financing complications that surfaced during my dispute were not the only ones. I do not know the full story. I do not need to. What mattered to me came in a brief note from Patricia after she heard what had happened. She wrote only one sentence. I put that language in there for a reason. Glad it held. I kept that note. Here is what I learned, or maybe what I confirmed, over the course of those months. Contracts are not formalities. They are the only surviving record of what was agreed to before the relationship changed. Most people sign them, file them away, and never look at them again. And that is exactly what the people writing them count on. The language that protects you is almost never the language that gets discussed out loud. It is buried. In the schedules. In the exhibits. In the appendices. In the clauses that seem hypothetical when you sign them, which is why so many people do not fight for them when they still have the chance. Those are the clauses that matter. I also learned something about patience. There is a special kind of pressure that builds when you know what you know, and you have not acted on it yet. When you are sitting in meetings with people who believe the situation has already been resolved to their satisfaction, and you know it has not, that pressure does strange things to you. It makes you want to move too fast, to say too much, to let your anger leak out in ways that give the other side information they have not earned. I understood during those months why so many people fail in that stretch. It requires stillness, a kind of stillness that does not come naturally when your future, your work, your dignity, and your family's security all feel like they are hanging in the balance. What helped me was something my father used to say when I was young and impatient. He would say, "The river does not argue with the rock. It just keeps moving. Eventually, the rock is not there anymore." I thought about that line often. I thought about it when Marcus used the word valued 3 times in 4 sentences. I thought about it when I sat in my truck before walking into the office and reminded myself to behave exactly the way I had always behaved. Because the moment you change your behavior, you tell them something. The moment you show your hand too early, you give away part of the only leverage that matters. The river does not argue with the rock. It moves. And I want to say one more thing, because I think this is the part that matters most. This was not really about the money. I know how that sounds. $430,000 is not a small number. And I want to be honest about that. It changed things for my family in ways that were real and lasting. My daughter's college is fully covered. My wife and I have had conversations about the next chapter of our lives that we could not have had otherwise. Those things matter. They are not symbolic, they are not abstract. But that was not what I was fighting for when I sat at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night with a highlighter in one hand and my employment agreement in the other. I was doing it because someone had made a decision about my worth. And that decision was wrong. I had the ability to say so in a language they could not ignore. I had spent 22 years in rooms with people who spoke in numbers, schedules, thresholds, obligations, and contractual terms. I had learned that language. I had used it for the company for 2 decades. And when the moment came, I used it for something else. I used it for myself. That, I think, is what 22 years is actually worth. I work independently now. I consult for 3 clients in the fluid systems sector. including one account I brought with me from Meridian, a client that specifically requested I continue managing their projects. I set my own hours. I work from my home office most mornings. For the first time since I was in my 20s, I take a real lunch break. My wife says I seem like a different person. Maybe she is right, or maybe I am just the same person with less left to prove. A former colleague reached out to me a few months ago. He was dealing with his own restructuring, pressure around his compensation package, the familiar language, the familiar smile, the familiar quiet threat hidden inside corporate politeness. He asked whether we could talk. We met in a diner near his office and sat there for 2 hours. I walked him through everything I knew. What to document, what to ask for, how to read a contract the way it is actually written, not the way you hope it was written, how to separate emotion from sequence, how to understand timing, how to let the paper speak before you do. Before he left, he asked me what the hardest part had been. I thought about it for a minute. Then I told him the truth. The hardest part was the stretch before anything was resolved. Before you know how it ends. When you are carrying something you believe in and no one else can see it yet. When you go to work every morning, act normal, answer emails, sit in meetings, shake hands, and all the while carry the one thing that is both your greatest protection and the thing that keeps you awake at night. He asked me how I got through that part. I told him I thought about my father. I thought about my daughter. And I reminded myself every single day that patience is not the same thing as passivity. He nodded. He paid for his coffee. He shook my hand and walked out into the parking lot. I watched him go, and I hoped that when he got home, he would do the one thing most people never do. I hoped he would sit down, open the drawer, pull out the contract he signed years ago, and actually read it. Because buried somewhere inside those pages may be the difference between what they think they can take from you and what they are legally required to give back. And if this story stays with you, remember that. Read the schedules. Read the exhibits. Read the clauses nobody talks about when things are going well. Because when the room changes, when the language shifts, when the people across the table start using words like restructuring, transition, alignment, and valued, those forgotten pages may be the only thing standing between your years of loyalty and someone else's calculation. 22 years is a long time to give a company. Long enough to learn the system. Long enough to understand the trap. Long enough, if you are paying attention, to know exactly where the exit is. If this story meant something to you, stay with us. There is more ahead.